Great. I have the wonderful pleasure now to be together with Yatsu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, and also founder and CEO of Outplace. Hi, Yat.
Hi, nice pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you again. And I love your background, calling us from the metaverse. So just very quickly, actually, in my own words, I always say, Yatsu is the tech entrepreneur here in this part of the world. And you're the co-founder of Chairman and Animoca Brands. And we'll talk much more about Animoca Brands, but it is a company really focusing and leveraging on popular brands, gamification, AI, blockchain, NFTs, mobile technology, to really make engaging apps ranging from games all the way even to fitness solutions and education, right? And you began your career way back in Germany with Atari, so already in the gaming industry back in 1990, came then to Hong Kong in 1995 to establish, it was the first free web page, right? An email provider here in Hong Kong with CyberCity, Free Nation. Fast forward, founded Outplace in 98. And then in 2009 sold Outplace services to IBM. So I guess it was your first super successful exit, right? And then really to turn that into a conglomerate specializing on cloud, AI, blockchain, mobile software. You have a true passion for music as well, and you hold actually several awards also in that part, but also you are a global leader of tomorrow at the World Economic Forum, won multiple prizes, Young Entrepreneur of the Year at the DHL SCMP Awards, and so on. But I throw the ball back to you. So if you would describe your career a little bit and maybe some turning points or important milestones.
Yeah, actually, I like the fact that you say I started in the 90s because that doesn't date me as much, but actually I started in the 80s. So I'm a little bit older. But anyway, I would say the very first and perhaps maybe the biggest turning point, although I didn't think of it at the time, was, when I actually was writing, when I started getting into coding as a child, really, I was studying music, because of my family. I grew up in Vienna, which is, I guess you could say, certainly a classical music capital. And, music wasn't really my particular passion. I didn't have a choice, really, I would say. However, I ended up using the computer to help me at the time. And I ended up coding some software that I then uploaded onto a service at the time called CompuServe, which is kind of like a pre-internet type of dial-up service. And actually, that's how I got discovered. And the short of the long is that experience really as a child, right, taught me a few things. One of them was that, it didn't matter, who I was or how old I was, for instance. I was able to be discovered, have an opportunity simply by what I knew because I could code, even though it was self-taught. And that, online, basically people would just literally send me money, for the services I had offered, in the form of a check. So very primitive, of course. But, eventually that led to a job at Atari because they also contacted me online and said, hey, we like the software you're writing. Why don't you come work with us? Because coders were difficult to find. And then I go in and they're like, wait, how old are you? Right. So that's kind of how it started. The other thing that it also taught me a little bit about was, and again, I didn't understand this as well as I do today, of course, is that I actually became part of a community. And I became part of a sort of, let's call it a virtual community, like a pre-metaverse type experience, where the reality of my sort of virtual life actually became maybe more prominent than my physical one, meaning that I was basically finding employment, I was making friendships, I was getting connected, I was growing as a person, but entirely through virtual activities, with people that I have never met in person, through a medium that is very uncommon, right? And of course, in the 80s and even in the 90s, it was kind of a weird paradigm. But as a result, for me, it always felt natural. So actually, I came to Hong Kong in '93, and I started one of Hong Kong's first internet service providers called Hong Kong Online. And actually, this was dial-up internet, right? Kind of like an America Online version, but, with internet and in Hong Kong. And, that didn't go very far. However, again, for me, it was just a conviction that, oh, everyone should have the internet because it benefited me. I wasn't thinking about business plans. I wasn't thinking about, how to make money out of this in the biggest possible way. I was just thinking, this is something that's valuable for all of us. We should all have it. And, I want to build my business and my life around it. So I'm just going to try to set it up, right? So I think the lesson here, obviously, from a business standpoint, it was kind of early, but from sort of the way I approach pretty much everything I've done in life is sort of on a conviction basis and kind of just, sort of going at it. And of course, as you get older, you may be a little wiser and you're sort of more aware about how to do certain things. But the idea largely has stayed the same. And the other part is that it's about creating the future you want to see. Basically, when I set up an ISP, frankly, it was probably a horrible business idea. Certainly in '93, there were like, what, 30,000 internet, sort of actual internet access points probably around the world, maybe a bit more, but anyway, it was tiny, right? Most of them were in these walled gardens like AOL or CompuServe or Genie or Prodigy, right? All these names that people of a certain generation will remember. So setting that up was kind of, sort of, you could call it sort of maybe a bad business idea. But it wasn't about the business. It was about building something that we thought would be better in the kind of way that, in a place where, we wanted to be, right? And so it left a lot to the imagination, because the internet was a terrible experience in '93. You go in, you put up your Mosaic browser and you go, what is this, right? It looks terrible, right? However, if you can project where that could go, and if you think about sort of the parameters and the sharing and the information and the democratization of knowledge, then, that becomes exciting, right? So that's basically sort of, I guess, I don't know if you want to call it a sort of a pivotal point, but it's the way I've addressed everything. And not everything has been successful, of course, right? We spent a lot of time early in AR that didn't quite work out that well. We continue to do a lot in ed tech and education as well, because again, it's a conviction point, right? It's something that I think is important, but is it making money? No. Right? Is it important?
Not yet.
Yes, right. Right. So same thing, right? But then sometimes, like, with conviction about sort of data ownership and data rights with blockchain, that was high conviction as well. Did it make money? Not for a long time, right? But then, of course, recently it really started to explode, right? So I think these sort of, driving and building businesses on the basis of what we describe as impact and purpose actually provides, I think, staying power. And I think that's probably the one big thing that, out of all of these twists and turns and sort of troubles that we had as we sort of grew over these many decades, is probably the one big thing that I would probably take away in terms of trying to build things with impact and purpose.
Yes, and those people who know you really truly could, understand that importance of community. I did not want to put you on the spot again as the grandfather of the startup ecosystem here, but you did it yourself, so you definitely deserve that title. But I think that the true passion for community and seeing the value, I think we go way a long time back, and we have been very fortunate of you also helping us in our passion of building the startup ecosystem, and even being an advisor on Angel Hub, on the platform, investing into our companies, and vice versa. So that's beautiful. And I think with that, it would be also nice for you to kind of, like, in your own words, describe Animoca brands, because I think we can see that sense of community also in the way how you look on building the brands.
Yes. So Animoca Brands as a company is really about sort of building essentially sort of the open metaverse. And the main thing that we're driving is delivering a sort of true digital ownership through property rights, digital property rights. And I think the parallel around this is that we want to create a company that isn't actually trying to control the space. Instead, we want to build a company that is essentially building the open metaverse, which is why we've invested in over 100 companies now in the NFT space. We were early in Axie Infinity and OpenSea and Dapper Labs and Bitski, and of course we own the Sandbox and Rev Racing and a series of things that we've ended up building. But it's all around sort of building sort of the open metaverse and delivering true data rights to everyone in the world. It looks from the surface that we're a gaming company, because we do believe that gaming is the path of mass adoption for blockchain and for data rights and data ownership. But it isn't just about gaming, right? Our sort of a mission is to basically change the way sort of we live, work, and play, right? And I think that's already beginning, at least certainly not just from a gaming standpoint, but just generally everything that's happening in the blockchain space. And I think the big meta is, data rights. Why is it important? And the most important thing around it is that data is the most valuable resource on Earth today, right? It is no longer oil or stuff you grow that is most valuable. It is actually your data. And that data comes from you, in fact. This is the other paradigm that's changed, which is the most valuable resource on Earth, actually is something that is individual to every person, which means also that for the first time, that sort of individualism that individual creativity, that individual talent can actually be truly valued as a truly scarce resource that it should be, that it hasn't been in the, certainly in the industrial age or in the industrial business models of the past. But the problem is that that data doesn't belong to us because it isn't in some kind of charter of human rights. Data isn't a human right. Data is a service, is an activity that it belongs to the companies that harvest it for the time being. And those companies are Facebook or Tencent or Amazon or whatever, right? And the amount of data that they have makes them more powerful, and they yield that data. And then basically what they do is actually, frankly, they sell it back to us or even use it against us, which is sort of really, exploitative. And we think of this as a kind of digital colonialism that we live in today. No different than, hundreds of years ago when the sort of the imperial age was sort of in full swing. We just have a kind of digital imperialism, if you will, for the time being. And that needs to change. And so Animoca Brands is about changing that. And we think the way to change it is to basically give everyone their data back and have a way for them to truly own their data. And sort of non-fungible tokens, and why that's so important, is that parallel. It's that sort of method in which we can actually own that data, own the embedded network effects within it, and therefore get all the benefits from that as well, which is basically Web3, right?
Absolutely. Well, great. Fantastic. I actually going to directly dig a little bit deeper and dive into this, concept of blockchain and non-fungible tokens, right? NFTs allowing now big shifts in the entire industry, in the value creation, who creates it, who captures it, and also, in terms of really creating the need for a real reinvention of the industry. I remember you giving a talk at our last conference, SIS, called Decentralized or Die, really talking about the internet of value, exactly what you were explaining. Now, I just want to, focus in. Does that mean we are now seeing the Kodak moment of big tech? Is it finally arriving? What do you think about when you hear Mark Zuckerberg saying, I'm going to be part of the metaverse, so I bring my big tech into that decentralized world? Tell us a little bit more about how you think things will be evolving.
So first of all, I think that the fact that big tech is looking at this very seriously is a signal that certainly everyone in our industry, including ourselves, are obviously doing something right. Because people wouldn't wake up to this and say, we need to do something if it didn't matter, right? So that's the first thing. But I do worry about this because frankly, one of the biggest concerns I have is that, as I said earlier, I described the age we live in as a kind of digital imperialism, and the companies like Facebook are really basically digital kings or emperors, if you will. Right? And which king willingly gave up his kingdom? Right? In history, that's been rather rare, if ever. So that basically means that the change doesn't come typically from those organizations from within. They typically come from outside and force large groups, organizations, governments, whatever you call it, to change. Right? And those who cannot change may have a Kodak moment. But for those of them who do change, the change comes because it's forced upon them. Right? And I think this is the thing that is so important now from our perspective is we have to make sure that the open metaverse is large and resilient enough that essentially the network effects embedded within the open ecosystem is so powerful that the largest of companies basically have to sort of play openly in the space. And it's kind of similar to the parallel around sort of free trade in the physical world, right? You could choose to be participating in the global economy, or you could choose to lock yourself economy sort of in a walled garden way. But what happens? In those scenarios, you end up becoming like a North Korea, which is not very good at all, right? And the benefits of being a sort of maybe controlled but economy the size of North Korea is so detrimental that every other nation in the world says, I'd rather be part of global trade. Let me join the WTO, right? And the same effect we've seen with the earliest forms of Web 1, Web 2, which is essentially open source, right? There's no company in the world today that doesn't use open source anymore, right? I mean, closed source, right? Open source is the only way to build and sort of adapt on top. But of course, the knowledge you contribute, the knowledge you gain, whatever you develop, you have to contribute back to open source, which essentially creates a real democratization and sort of sharing of information and knowledge in the form of code, in the form of open source. And that open source is the reason why a 5 or 10-person organization can compete with the likes of an Alibaba or a Google because he has access to that entire pool of knowledge, right? That's the embedded network effect within open source that is accessible to everyone. This part is currently missing in the world of data, and especially digital property rights doesn't exist, and therefore we have no way in participating in that manner because the network effect doesn't belong to us or we have a way even to buy network effects. We have an imperfect way. Who has some of the best network effects in the world for data? It might be Facebook. How do I participate? I have to buy Facebook shares, right? But who controls the company and how is it run? And what voice do I have? Frankly, very little, right? So the actual involvement is really a derivative structure, which doesn't actually give us the kind of rights that we deserve, especially because the data comes from us. And that, unfortunately, is what we think groups like Facebook are still thinking about, because naturally, from a shareholder value standpoint, they have to think, how do I play in this field while not essentially changing everything or maybe even making ourselves obsolete, right? And that's the problem about, typically from an innovation standpoint, it's a classic innovator's dilemma. And I think that's going to hold a lot of the large companies back for the time being. But that's the opportunity for people building in the open metaverse. And I think this is the part that I worry about in terms of, the internet. If you think back from the first 15 years of the growth of the internet from the 90s up until the mid 2000s, the idea that there could be a big walled garden that comes in and sort of takes over the internet was almost unthinkable. AOL actually tried that in the mid 90s and failed. And that was kind of the declaration of quasi-internet victory. It says open will always win. But that wasn't true anymore, and so I think therefore the open metaverse is actually somewhat vulnerable still. It's possible for it to be in a walled garden, and so we have to resist that. And that's why we're building Animoca Brands as a way to ensure that, to create essentially a better future for everyone.
Right. And so again, now it's all about speed, right, and scale. So arguably getting really to this mass adoption. And with that, you must be really happy seeing so many different industry, arts, entertainment, etc., right, hopping on the bandwagon of NFTs and mass adoption. But before we go into other industries, coming back again to the gaming industry, and again coming back to shifting value creation, new business models. So we have seen the evolution from pay to play, right? Then it was free to play with in-app purchases, or people made revenues through advertising, right? To then finally now play to earn. Right. So those people who create the assets, the engagement, the experience are the ones who can benefit and even make a living out of it. Right. And at the same time, we had this rise in mobile games and multiplayer online games. So arguably, Roblox is not blockchain and NFT enabled, right? But we're kind of like now with Animoca Brands, right? Sandbox, it's the evolution, right? That demystified this a little bit. And when was this aha effect of this is going to happen thanks to blockchain and NFTs?
So the one thing to understand is that, I think of blockchain almost as a concept, right? Almost, in the future as one of, let's call it democracy, right? Like we know about it, we hear about it, we understand it. We may not fully participate in it, but it's the reason why the system works. It's a judicial layer almost to ensure that we have the rights that we do, right? In the physical world, a democratic framework in which we have a voice is the way that we protect our property. If I own property, I need to protect it. How do I protect it? By having a voice. How do I have a voice? Because I'm part of a democratic system, or I have some influence, right? And sort of the more ownership you have in the world in terms of property rights, frankly, the more you secure that the government is one of the people as opposed to one of the few. And that's basically one of the things that is missing in the data landscape today. So what we need to do as a group, as a whole, right, is to ensure that data ownership and data rights is pervasive, because it means that we all have a reason to protect it. If we actually don't own anything in this particular world, then frankly, do we actually care about this? And we see this today. We willingly give up our data to Facebook by using WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram every day, for a derivative value that pays us very, very little, if anything at all. And we do so because we don't value it, because there's nothing to value, because we don't own it, right? So that's the issue, right? So it's really important that we sort of derive and push that value out there to everyone. Once you achieve that, then essentially you've created a paradigm that's so much better. Every artist who's making money in NFTs, he's never going back to sort of the platform. Every musician that is making music by creating sort of his paradigms around that isn't going back. Every person who's basically owning their actual digital assets inside a game, who he can fairly monetize, trade it, and the composability around it, he's never going back, because he sees the value that is in there. Time is the most precious thing we have on Earth. If you think about us as humans, the data that we produce is a derivative of our time. And time is finite for each and every one of us, because we only live so long, right? So what is more scarce than our time? And we can decide how to spend it, right? Whether it's for work, building a business, or spending time with family, the value of that time is scarce. That value, that scarce aspect in the online world doesn't belong to us though, right? And so now with this paradigm, you protect that. And whether I use my time to create a beautiful piece of art that I can then sell, whether I play in a game and I earn money because of the value I deliver from that, all of these add up, and you won't go back when you are able to sort of be in that space. The other thing is that because these are NFTs and they're open, is they become openly composable, meaning that third parties can add into it and create peer-to-peer business relationships and scale and grow the overall economics of all of it. When you think about our interaction in the physical world, whether it's the selling of shoes or the selling of cars or the selling of anything, right? Just because you have ownership of these assets, entirely new industries spring about, right? Whether it's the accessorization of cars, whether it's the fuel economies, whether it's people drawing on shoes, whether people get collector's experiences, whether it's a driver economy, the employment and the work and the labor around the industries of ownership is significantly larger than the sale of these assets themselves, which gives rise to a vibrant ecosystem, but also influences the assets themselves. For instance, your decision to buy a Tesla versus a Toyota might be determined by not just if it's green, but what do your friends think about it? Is there enough charging stations? What's the mechanical support I can get, right? All these things external start to influence your decision whether you want to buy this car or not. And that is essentially something that wasn't possible before with sort of data and sort of virtual objects, because you never owned them. You needed permission for everything. But with non-fungible tokens, you actually own that, right? And therefore, someone can do business directly with you just because you own it. And so it's happened now with lending platforms saying, yeah, hey, just give me your NFT and I can actually collateralize it because it has value, right? Or when you see other projects people are actually taking these assets and creating new game environments on top of it and creating new layers of experiences, making these NFTs more valuable and also more precious as a result of that. And again, by owning a piece of those NFTs or part of that ecosystem, you own a part of that network effect, right? So I think that's sort of, also the reason why we invested so heavily, because we don't believe that this is a space that any one company ought to dominate. This is a space that sort of has to be co-built, which is why we've been so aggressively investing in the space, because we think that the only way to build it open is to keep it open.
To keep it open, right? And you talk about ecosystem, right? And we talk about the importance now of mass adoption. And I know your early investments into CryptoKitties, right, was already kind of like a first approach on getting to bigger adoption, right? And involved in selling the formula, the first digital, right, NFT Formula One car, and obviously also knowing very well the scene around the sales of the Beeple, and that sold off for the 69 million US dollars, right, at Christie's. And my point is, what do you think is still missing in the ecosystem, right? Is it better ways for liquidity on bridging the online to the offline world? What is it for you that's going to drive that next leap in mass adoption? So from, again, CryptoKitties to Formula One cars to arts to what is it, and,
yes.
and what is necessary? Maybe also more integration within the fintech ecosystem, right?
Understand. Yeah. So first of all, I think what's missing, and it's coming anyway. So it's less about what's missing. It's just how soon will it appear, right? To me, the first driver is gaming, and Axie Infinity, is definitely demonstrating that potential. I view Axie Infinity as sort of the Angry Birds moment of NFT gaming, if you will. Right? And it's very similar to mobile game adoption. When in fact even Steve Jobs himself, when the iPhone first launched, did not visualize the iPhone as a gaming device. He thought of it as simply as, in fact, he didn't like the fact that it was so heavily focused on gaming, because he wasn't the gamer and he didn't think it was that valuable. In fact, there were times where he even thought about possibly banning Unity and sort of SDKs around it, because it was kind of usurping his vision of what it was. But gaming actually drove that adoption for smartphones, as it drove adoption for GPUs and CPUs and PCs, and entire businesses like PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo exist entirely for virtual spaces, right? In this case, virtual play. Right? And so similar, like Angry Birds did that for the smartphone, essentially Axie Infinity is doing this now for NFT gaming, where everyone's waking up, but with some level of disbelief. If you think about back in the day, when people looked at Angry Birds as a game, the very first comment that most traditional gamers and game studios said, that isn't a game. Right, you're just swiping, right? Right. But and
Sure.
you're having the same kind of visceral reactions around, oh my goodness, that's not a game. Oh my goodness, it's a Ponzi scheme. Oh my goodness, right? Because they're all missing the point. But of course, they haven't played the game necessarily. They don't know what it's about. They're judging from the outside because it is a threat to the way that things are operating. And free to play had that threat too. Everyone who was in the traditional sort of
Right.
a subscription or pay model said, oh, free to play is completely going to ruin the gaming industry. And probably most of the world today is in the free to play industry. So I think that evolution is going to happen, and it's going to happen very fast because the value is there. So I think gaming and blockchain is already well on the move, but because evolutionary, visually and sort of artistically and sort of technically, we are kind of at an Angry Birds-like stage. Some of the sophisticated mechanisms that we need for games to come about are currently being developed. In fact, we just announced one of our own titles called Phantom Galaxies, which is a AAA type of game to bring in sort of more of a traditional gamer will happen. Right? So all those people who are deep into sort of console and PC gaming, who are serious gamers, they're going to look at those type of games and say, actually, that's a kind of game I would like to play too, right? And then suddenly they say, but actually I can own that. So I think that's the part where we get to wider adoption, where people are stepping out of the Angry Birds moment and going more into a mainstream moment as a result of that. And the way to trigger that movement is value, meaning that, in order, like, we don't believe that making it too easy to onboard is necessarily the right solution, because that basically forces a kind of centralization. We actually think that there's an education involved, like opening a bank account. If I open a bank account, I need to learn a little bit about finances. I need to know a little bit about managing my accounts and balancing a checkbook and all that kind of stuff, right? I can't just have an account and that's it, and they'll take care of everything for me. That's actually kind of dangerous. And so similarly to this, I feel like if there is value to be had, people will learn it. So if I play a blockchain game or some X Infinity, or in the future, like our Phantom Galaxies or Rev Racing right now, or whatever it is, then actually what I may be able to do is accumulate value. And then to accumulate value, I need to open a wallet. What does that mean? And what do I have to do? At that point, I'm willing to do it. Just like how you're willing to wait in line, to cash in your check, right? You're willing to go and do that. And actually opening a DeFi wallet is actually easier than opening a bank account, right? Actually, if you think of it that way. So in that context, I think we think the adoption will come from the perspective of the value, not so much from the ease of use. Ease of use will hopefully happen evolutionary, but if it's too easy, I think we go into this trap back into where things are centralized, because from a UX standpoint, you have to control more to make it too easy. And I think there is an aspect of sort of understanding that, right? It's to me, it's a similar parallel around sort of the way we think of sort of democracy, for instance, right? Not everyone fully appreciates it, but you need enough of a population to appreciate it, to sort of defend that concept, to go and vote for people, right? To do all that stuff, right? That is important, which means you do have to understand, more than just intellectually, sort of the value and importance of it, and go through the motions, like going for an election and taking care and listening to it and caring about it, right? So those are the same things I think that will have to happen here, because this is about financial inclusion. This isn't about,
absolutely.
Yeah, this isn't just about.
That's why I was talking about fintech, right? And the linkage to the fintech system, and also again, I was like, how do you create, part of that liquidity in the offline world? To your point, right? Creating value in the offline world through the online, activity.
Yeah, I mean, financial inclusion is therefore an act that requires responsibility, right? You can't just sort of say, hey, I have a bunch of money, what do I do now? You have to understand what the consequences are as part of that process as well. And I think this is something, therefore, when we talk about sort of ease of adoption, I think of it as a path in which we aim, so creating this financial inclusion, actually educate them in terms of what it means to have this type of financial. And if you look at, for instance, like in rural Philippines, you have so many people now having DeFi wallets, in some cases more than actual credit cards in their particular communities. That sends an incredible signal in terms of how the world is changing.
Right, absolutely. Unfortunately, the time is up. I would have loved to dig even deeper in the whole dynamics of this ecosystem. Now, I just want to have one last question addressed, because I remember a year back, it was at the beginning of, for 1.5 years, even beginning of the pandemic. I remember we talked about gaming industry, how it's going to evolve. You said, well, obviously we're on role now. Every day is a Sunday, people are behind their screens, and you made this bold statement about the gaming industry being a industry that is evolving from $100 billion industry to a several $trillion industry in the next decade. So I was just wondering, does that statement still hold true, or do you want to make it even bolder? It's not going to take a full decade to become a $1 trillion industry.
So, what I guess you could say I was hedging my bets in terms of when I say within the 10 years, it will turn into a multi-trillion industry. I think it's going to happen within the next 5 years, the way things are going. Okay. But when you take a look at how much value is being generated, these games and these token ecosystems and these NFT ecosystems, whether it's an Axie or like our sandbox or even Rev, right? Actually, they're becoming economies, they're GDPs, right? And you can see the growth and scale and size of that. And one of the other things that's interesting is that these gaming metaverses are going to cross over into sort of more than just a game. It's governance, it's life, it's sort of employment, right? So there's going to be a lot of interesting intersections, but as a result of that, I think it's going to be absolutely massive. And of course, as a result of that, companies like Facebook are obviously clearly seeing that as well and looking at that space rather keenly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah. So all the follow-on discussions, we have to put that to a next panel or fireside. But thank you again for sharing your insights. So this was a fireside with Yatsu, co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands, which I think we'll still hear a lot more in the near future. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.